7, and we are on, I hope you remember that we are on chapter number 13 of the Gospel of Mark, and we are doing all the background historical context about the fall of the Temple of Jerusalem. Because until and unless we understand what were the events that finally, carried the whole situation towards bringing down the Jerusalem temple, I think we as Christians will never understand, the original church which was based in Jerusalem, because Jesus, when we say he died more or less between the years 30, some say 30, some say 33. I tend to go more by the 33 AD date. So whatever the case be, 30 or 33, from then on right up till to almost 30 years, the Jerusalem temple, that was actually the Jerusalem community of the early Christians, was growing, and most of the time they used to be meeting in the temple. So temple was also the focal point where the community actually grew. So today when we look at Christian history, for us Rome, is considered to be the seat of Catholicism. That is just last week, I think all of you were, all of us were glued to the news about who would be the Pope and how those things are happening in the Vatican. But if you look back at history, and had the temple not fallen in the year 70 AD, had it not been burned down to the ground by the Romans, who knows how the church really would have looked as of now. Would it really be the Roman church that would have dominated, or the Jerusalem church would be the one, that actually would have called the shots? So it is this background in mind, we need to know how finally the Christian community, when all these events that were, happening in Judea and particularly centered around Jerusalem, where were they and how they were viewing all these things. We need to know that. Only then we will come to a proper understanding how Christian history down the centuries has come to what it looks like today. Okay, so we continue with in the last session 26, we were looking at the various groups that were there. We sometimes are under the impression that Jerusalem in the first century, during the time of Jesus, it was only one type of Judaism, or sort of just one little cultural religious identity which was common to all. But we have seen last time how the Essenes were one group, they had a different way how they practiced Judaism of the other. So what was their understanding? So similarly, we had other groups. I have just slightly touched upon the Zealots, which I will be doing in great detail today. And of course, as we have been going through the Gospel of Mark, we have constantly, been coming across the Pharisees, who were the dominant group of the Judea of that time, and also the Sadducean priesthood, which was just a minority clan. Yet they were the most powerful because they were the ones who were co-rulers with their Roman collaborators. Okay, so they were sort of collaborators with Rome, and that's how they were viewed at. So if you look, deeply through the window of how things were going about, there were various groups. Today in particular, we will be touching upon the Zealots, who were the final, group of people who were instrumental in bringing things to such a head that finally Jerusalem invited the wrath of Rome in full blast, and finally we see the temple being burned down by Titus and his army. So let me share my screen and take you back a little bit where we had stopped, I think, with the Essenes. Just let me share the screen first. Can you see? I think it is visible. Okay. So here we are with session 27. Just 5 or 6 slides in detail, because I did not get the time to actually pick out these pictures about the Qumran community, because their view, their worldview matters a lot to us, because they come very close to the Christian outlook of what it really meant, to look forward to the day of the Lord. So I will just, the first few slides, I think it's around 8 to 9 slides. Just I will be touching about the Qumran Essenes, which I've already discussed, so I will not be spending much time on this. Okay, these were the caves, okay, the barren, this is the aerial view of the entire settlement of Qumran. And the people who lived over there, we know they were the Essenes because Josephus mentions. So there are many scholars, till today, just a minority of them, who are not really convinced that the community that was there down, okay, in the settlements, they were all, man-made caves where they lived. That is called the Qumran settlement. And the people who produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found in the high cliffs, okay, along these mountains, they are the same community. But there is lot of archaeological evidence because whatever jars and all were found down, okay, at the base camp where the Qumran community was, resident, and the material culture that is found, the same type of jars, because these Dead Sea Scrolls were all stored in jars. So that pottery and all, when they use the scientific carbon dating and all, it has been, proved that the chemical composition of the jars found over there and those found in the cliffs, okay, where the scrolls were all stored, it is one and the same. So most of the scholars, almost 95% of the scholarly world believes that the Essenes were the same people who produced the Dead Sea Scroll. So most of them, just in order to avoid any debate, normally they are referred to as the Qumran community. And we have seen how they lived, okay? They renounced all their worldly ties, they gave up, possessions and all. They had to sign away all their possessions, and it all became part of the community, had very frugal meals. So, a sort of a communal life, like how you, as religious communities, as monastic communities, how you live your life, those actually the origins are more or less from here. Okay? So here, this is the aerial view of the community where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. These were the Bedouin shepherds, okay, both of them, they were the ones who were first credited with discovering the first Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, their pictures are put out here. This was way back in 1947. This is the main parchment. This is one of the 6 copies of the MMT. What is, this MMT? It is called the Masoretic text. This is supposed to be the original text of the Hebrew Bible, from which later on huge, copies were made. So when archaeologists have looked at this community, they have found plenty of inkwells, so much so that even writing, sort of desk and tables, that suggests that this was a community that was actually engaged in copying the sacred text. And in one of the copies, they find this main principle. It's called the Mixat Mashia Atora. That is the original text of the Hebrew Bible, from which most of the things were copied. But then when scientists, when the scholars and all, they compare the scrolls and all, they also feel that most of the things are very close to the Septuagint. You remember the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament? Okay, it was done much before the coming of Christ. Okay, so many of the things, they are very much in agreement with the Septuagint. So what is indicative of this is this community was actually in possession of the entire Hebrew canon and even some of the Greek material, and many of the scrolls are also in Aramaic. So much before the original copies were later on what we had, okay, this people already had in their possession. For millennia, the darkened caves peering out over the Dead Sea stood guard over one of the world's greatest archaeological treasures, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, so since their discovery, they have shed a lot of light on the Bible, the Second Temple, what types of Judaisms were there, and also in a certain way Christian origins too. But many questions still remain. It's not a settled matter. Okay, many of the people, initially the scholars, they surmised that the scrolls that were found, they must have been, deposited over there by the Jerusalem temple priests who were fleeing when the Roman destruction of Jerusalem was coming. So early on, when they were first discovered, this was, a very predominant view that was held. But now everyone knows that, from the writings when they have been deciphered, in fact, this was a sectarian community which was deadly against the Jerusalem priesthood. So much so they considered the Jerusalem priesthood to be completely corrupt, and they were the real people of the covenant. They would call themselves the sons of light. So no way it could be writings that would be produced by the Jerusalem priest. These are the caves, okay? Like you have cave 3, cave 2. I have just put out all these details so that you can just, when you have the time, you can read a lot. It is cave number 4, which is the most, important because maximum scrolls have been discovered over there. Also in cave 11. These caves which are closest to the site, 4, 5, 7, 8, 9 and 10, okay, here what they are shown, they were actually carved out or chiseled out by hand because that sandstone, okay, the natural rock of the cliffs and all, it is supposed to be very soft called marl sandstone, which easily can be chiseled out, carved out, into small little caves. So the community, when they had to live, they were living in these type of chiseled out caves. But hiding the Dead Sea Scrolls high up, those are right up above in the limestone cliffs. Okay. And cave number 4, I will be showing you a picture of this cave number 4 here. This is the particular cave, okay. Thousands of scroll fragments came from Qumran cave number 4, which is, the one that has the maximum deposits. But may I also share with you this important detail? The caves are so numerous, so many. The discovery of them, we cannot say it's complete. It is still ongoing. You never know, which cave may still yield up its secrets in the future. So this is an ongoing affair. I put you out a copy of the a picture of this jar. Okay, the size of it was almost 2 feet tall. So you can imagine how big those jars used to be, and especially these jars used to be. There is evidence at the site of Qumran that these pottery jars were manufactured also by them. So many of the scrolls discovered in the caves were all with this. Look at the base, how it was, okay? A very peculiar type of jar which is called the scroll jar. And how do the archaeologists know that there is a connection between the Qumran community down at the base of the mountains and the cliffs and the scrolls found up high above in the cliffs? It is because of the connection of the jars. The same are found at the site of Khirbat Qumran also. These were the writing desks. I put out these pictures. So probably remember the last time in the last session we had dwelled upon that aspect that they were a community that spent its time completely in prayer, in total silence most of the time, and worship. And beyond that, beyond these activities, they used to spend most of their day making copies of what scripture texts. And not only scriptural texts, but there are other texts also that are found, mostly written in Aramaic. Okay, so these are, okay, the archaeologists think that these are, plastered benches and tables at Qumran. So they must have been using this to sit down and make painstakingly all the scroll copies that we know of. Okay. This is one, picture of the most famous scroll that was early on discovered. It is called the war scroll, and it is from this war scroll when they actually read the text that was contained in this. Scientists, archaeologists, and scholars have realized that this was a community that had its own peculiar sectarian outlook. That same they had a belief in an eschatology, saying that through a final act of God, God would come to restore, order in this world. And then during that time, through his final act, when he would restore, okay, the world to normalcy, it would be accomplished through them. They were the community, and that is why they called themselves the sons of light. And all the rest of the community was always referred to as sons of Belial. Okay, so this is how we come to know that this is not a community which could have influenced Jesus in any way. Because look at the outlook of Jesus. These people at Qumran were very high on purity rituals. For them, purity meant everything. So all these rituals, of this purification, lot of these stands and all for bathing themselves clean several times. Mikvah, what they are called, all those bathing tanks are found plenty at this site. So definitely this could not be a community in which Jesus would find place. And definitely Jesus's worldview was very, very inclusive, not exclusive like how these people were. Jesus would have never called other people, sons of darkness, the way the people at Qumran identified themselves and called others violators of the covenant. So such type of very sectarian and narrow outlook definitely could not be of Jesus. And we know this for a fact from this war scroll, which is one of the most famous scrolls apart from, there's another one called the community scroll or the community document, which gives, how we know what were the rules the community followed, times of prayer, singing, worship and all. It's from the community rule. This is another famous one, the great Isaiah scroll. The Isaiah scroll is one that is, complete. This is not in fragments. And can you imagine what is the size of the scroll? It is almost 23.5 feet long. So you can imagine how heavy and big this scroll is to be, and how with so much devotion and dedication, these people turned it into scripture copies through which, we know the legacy of the Dead Sea community today. This was, this is a sort of, this is all the work of the archaeologists. They have dug out and, restored the site back to its original build. This is a sort of a place for their communal dining. They would eat together, as is mentioned in the community rule. This is one of the other important documents that is found, where it shows, how they were very, very strict. And it was a very austere community. I don't think even, in today's times, even the Carmelite sisters, okay, uh, those who completely renounce the world, the cloister community, even they can equal the austerity that was practiced by the Qumran community. This is an entire assemblage of all the bowls and all, okay, that was found at the site of Qumran. And this is put up in a sort of a museum jar and actually catalogued, giving you the numbers of how many bowls, plates, beakers, small jars. So what does it tell us? It tells us that this was a community that resided over there. It was a resident community that lived together as one community. So all this is a testament to the life the community led, which was finally, we know, was destroyed in 68 AD by Vespasian when he came on his way to Jerusalem. He slaughtered all the priests, some of them fled, okay, but the site never regained back, okay. It was never rehabilitated again, the people never came back to stay. This is the scriptorium, the place where all the inkwells and all writing implements and all have been discovered. Go through all this. We are coming now to the last group of the people, and the most troublesome, and the ones who were finally responsible. Today, I think, if we have to make a concluding remark, in conclusion, then we have surmised all the facets of the Jewish history, all the events preceding the fall of the temple. We can come to a very safe conclusion. It was because of the Zealots and the way they mishandled the whole thing. Not completely, we can say, but they were truly the ones who brought this wrath of Rome on the Jerusalem temple. Okay. So the rise of the Zealots and how Josephus describes them as a fourth group. He's already described the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes. Now he comes to the Zealots. He doesn't actually use the word Zealots, but later on they are given this name. They are called the fourth philosophy. Okay. And who was their leader? Initially, it was Hezekiah during the time of Herod the Great, and then later on his son Judas. Okay, so son of Hezekiah the bandit. So Judas is considered actually to be the leaders of the Zealots. He is the one who mobilized all of them together, bringing them together, and actually they are like any of you read through history and all, mostly like, you have this warfare in Latin America some decades ago. This used to be very, very common practice There was this famous, guerrilla fighter Che Guevara. So they were like, they were people who would ambush armies and all. They would not engage armies in open combat because they were small in numbers. So they would try to take tactical advantage by, coming down the mountains and attacking and slaying armies. So that is called guerrilla warfare. So that was the kind of warfare these zealots would engage in, trying to, slay all the rich, the wealthy people, but in particular armies of Herod and the Romans. So Judas was, a famous name, and Josephus calls him the leader of the fourth philosophy. Now, how this zealotry, the zealots, how they came to be such a predominant group, even during the time of Jesus, they were there, but more or less they were, finding their way back. They were not a very powerful force at the time when Jesus died. But prior to him, definitely was, okay, from the time of Herod on, there was an intense, fierce engagement on both sides. Later on, they subsided because constantly, they were sought out, massacred, killed. But after 52, they became a force to reckon with. And finally, they are the ones who, mustered the people for rebellion, and they rebelled against Rome, and we will see what happens with them. The zealots, Judas the son of man. From the day the Romans took over Judea, Jewish rebels began launching raids against them from the Judean mountains and highlands. You have seen the pictures, no? Yeah, of Qumran, and especially when you go down south, the Judean desert is, it's a very scorching place, no place to be there. But these were the places that offered natural hideouts for these people, and they would be here. So from here they would mount their attack on the armies of Rome and those of Herod. They believed that if they fought bravely, they were driven by a particular vision of life. They were, inspired by the miraculous victory stories from the book of Joshua, especially also from the book of Maccabees. So they always felt that how the Hebrew Bible, always believed that God would come to the rescue of the warriors who fought for him and who accepted him as their sole ruler. These people also were fired with that type of vision. And that is why from the time Pompey stormed into Jerusalem way back in 63 BC, much before Herod and all came on the scene, even from that time and before, they always rebelled. So this was, a fire that always burned in their hearts, and they would never accept any foreign ruler because they refused to call anybody their king except God. Their belief was that God alone is king. And that is the reason the high priest was considered a traitor by them. Why? Because for them, the high priest was a Roman collaborator. But when Pompey came and established, finally, Roman rule was established from then on, all political power was removed from the Hasmonean rulers, who were actually the rulers at that time. And because the brothers were fighting, one of the brothers, that is Hyrcanus, sought the intervention of Rome, and that's how Judea came to be, occupied by them. So they were always looked upon as, foreign occupiers, and they hated any foreigner who ruled them. So to deal with these rebels, the Romans appointed an Arab prince, Herod the Great, known for his boundless energy and equally matched cruelty. He was a very young man when he was actually picked up for the job. And we have to remember, when we look into the history of Herod, which I will run you through shortly now, Herod had a lot of, diplomatic and political background which he achieved being the son of his father. His father, Antipater, he was a sort of a vizier, like, the prime minister of the king. The Hasmoneans were, puppet rulers now already. So it was Rome that was wielding all the power. So Antipater was a very fine diplomat for Herod's father. He was a very fine diplomat in the sense he just knew how to, maintain a good balance of power between the Romans and the Hasmoneans who were there in Jerusalem. So Antipater, being the son of Antipater, Herod, obviously up and close relationship with his father, he observed how, this balance of power could just be tilted with one, wrong move on the part of the ruler. So very early on in life, Herod, as a young boy, as a teenager, he got all the training under his father, who was very, very effective as a prime minister. In fact, Hyrcanus was, as good as nothing. It was Antipater who used to all call the shots. So Rome always looked upon Herod's father as the go-to man in order to sort out all the relations. Hyrcanus was just a sort of a decorative head of the state there in Judea. So very early on, Herod was very early in life involved in police action against the rebels. And these rebels, I told you, were always opposing Roman occupation, Roman rule. So Herod was, very feisty. They say he was a very strong man, very tall and handsome. And Herod, being what he was, being very robust in his physique also, he had a very commanding personality by which he could garner support of his armies around him, and also have a lot of loyalties of his armies around him. So very early on, Herod tasted power. He knew what it was to be like this. I've put out some pictures for you. Okay, he was made a sort of a governor of Jerusalem when his father was in power. But soon after his death in 43 BC, his father was poisoned to death by one of his enemies. There ensued a civil war amongst the Hasmoneans, during which Herod managed to escape to Rome to garner support. It's very interesting and riveting history. We all tend to look upon Herod as a very wild, wild character, a person who's capable of the most depraved acts in history. No doubt he was, but also there were, certain sterling qualities in Herod which made him stand out as a remarkable ruler. So here the moment, okay, there was always this infighting among the brothers, among this Hashmonean rulers. So Antipater was always in favor of Hyrcanus. Okay? He was a very weak ruler, so Antipater was the one who used to call the shots. So obviously power was actually wielded by Herod's father and his family, obviously, okay, but mostly his father. So the moment there was a fight and his brother assumed power and Hyrcanus was, dethroned, Herod knew that his life was in great danger and he fled. Okay, he escaped to Rome to garner support for the deposed King Hyrcanus. But the Roman Senate, impressed with the daring exploits of Herod in crossing the Mediterranean in the midst of stormy seas, crowned him king of Judea. So you see, these are the senators with the typical toga. Okay, the white toga. These are the top brass there in Rome. Okay, so the Senate was the one. He actually went to plead the case of Hyrcanus that he should, Rome should help him to regain power. They found Herod to be the man, okay, who would be able to do their bidding. And because finally for the Romans, what mattered to the Romans were just two things. Number one, stability. Okay, they wanted absolute peace so that there was, no chaos, no insurrections anywhere. And secondly, the coffers should keep, flowing with the money coming from the taxes. So these were the main things. They were not interested, in just, they directly ruling. That is why they always respected the local ruler so long as he accepted their overlordship and paid homage to them and gave the taxes. So here they found this young Herod. Okay, look at him, like a typical Jewish man with the earrings and all. They found him very, very dashing, okay, and this was not the first time, obviously, he had been to Rome. He had a sort of an education in Rome itself, okay, as a very young boy. So he was very familiar, okay, with the milieu there in Rome. So when he went and garnered support for the deposed ruler, he ended up himself winning the crown for himself. They thought that this is the man, okay, who would be able to guarantee stability, owe allegiance to them, and ensure that taxes would come into the Roman treasury. So here, Herod, this must have been something that he never really dreamt of. And this came in, fell in his platter. This is the way he ends up being the king of Judea. From the very start of Herod's rule in 37 BC, as Rome's client king of Judea, actually in 40 BC he was already crowned king, but when he came, the people in Judea wouldn't accept him, and there was a sort of a civil war that raged on for 3 years, and finally he succeeded. So when he was crowned king, in 40 and then wielded power. Actually, he won the whole thing in 37 BC, replacing the rule of the Hashmonean kings for almost 100 years. The Jewish people resented him because he was not fully Jewish for the simple reason that he was an Edomite. You know, Edom, E-D-O-M, I'll not put that out. Edom is, a close cousin of Israel. Sort of, in a sense, they are considered to be the descendants of whom? Of Esau. Remember, Jacob had two sons. Okay, one was, Isaac had two sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob is the other name for Israel, and Esau. Okay, he did not get the blessing of his father, but Edom is supposed to be the descendant nation coming from Esau, and that's why they are considered to be, close sort of cousins. And so these people were very much detested. The Israelites would not accept them as, one ethnic people. They were always considered to be foreign and outsiders. So Herod had double ancestry which was resented. He was an Edomite, plus his mother was a Nabatean princess. So basically he was an Arab. Okay, he was an Arab prince and he wouldn't be accepted. So when Jerusalem at last fell during Herod's assault, finally in 37, the Jewish Hasmonean king, there was one king, Antigonus, and Herod in particular had great resentment against this man because he was finally the one who had actually deposed Hyrcanus and, forcibly taken the throne. But before doing that, along with the Parthians, he was responsible for murdering Herod's own brother, Faisal. So that revenge was always there in Herod's heart. So when he finally fell, he was captured and sent to Syria, and he was scourged and crucified. Though Josephus, I think, mentions that he was beheaded, but scholars know that, he was actually scourged and crucified. Something very shameful for a king to be put to death in that way. And so died. He was the last of the direct line of monarchs of the Hashmonean bloodline. So Herod is now fully the legitimate king of Judea, but a very hated one because prior to this, almost more than 100 years, the Jewish people were used to having the Maccabean kings, the Hashmonean kings. Another word for the Maccabean kings is Hashmonean. So Herod, in order to win the hearts of his people, okay, he needed to legitimize his newly won throne in the eyes of the Jewish people. And he did this by, a sort of a master stroke. Actually, this was probably his destiny. We really don't know whether this was something completely intended by him, by design. Whether he did it, we are not very sure. But they say Herod's biographer, who is Nicholas of Damascus, who was his court historian, and he's the one who gives a detailed record of Herod's life. That's how we know so much of Herod. And it is these things that are borrowed by Josephus, obviously. So Nicholas of Damascus, he writes in great detail. He was also a great admirer of this king Herod. So here they say this, when he was a young man, when he was soon crowned king, within a few years, he was very much smitten by a Hashmonean princess called Mariamne. Okay, and in order to legitimize his newly won throne, he thought the best way would be to take a wife who would be a Hashmonean princess, and she was the granddaughter of the high priest and former king Hyrcanus, as his young bride of 16 years. When he married her, she was 16 years, but when he actually set his eyes, they say, on her, she was barely a 13-year-old child. And he was so smitten and carried away by her beauty that even at that point of time, though he loved his first wife very dearly, Doris by name, he exiled her and their 3-year-old son Antipater to pave way for his marriage to Mariamne, thus linking his bloodline to the Hashmonean kings. But despite getting married to Princess Mariamne, she became his queen. Do you think the people of Judea accepted Herod? Not at all. Until the end, they would never really, and especially not the zealots, not the rebels who always looked upon him as a foreign occupier of the seat which was reserved for a descendant of King David. So this is the story. So very interesting that a man like Herod whom we only know as a face of cruelty, could also be a man with, very tender devotions, and indeed he was. Mm. And in fact, it is only after the death of Mariamne I have put up, a still here from one of the movies that are made about Herod, so that, pictographically it remains in our mind. Herod first set his eyes, as I told you, on Mariamne when she was just a young girl of 13. But Jewish tradition forbade, okay, a bride to be less than 16 years. And so, obviously, he was not able to marry her. He had to wait for 3 years. And in the interim, what did he do? He did something very cruel. Sent his first wife and their son, who was barely just 3 or 4 years old, into exile. And a very strange twist of history is this is the same son. His son also was named Antipater. He is the same son he ordered to be, killed, executed just 3 days before Herod actually died. Okay. So historians and psychologists who study the life of Herod in great detail point out that Herod was obsessed with Mariamne. She was the love of his life, but did she love him in return? Not at all. The, the passion with which probably Herod loved her, with the same passion she equally hated him. But this was a marriage of convenience, and only to seal, to cement relations between the Ashmoneans, and in order to ensure, okay, a legitimate bloodline for Herod to legitimize his rule, this marriage was carried out. Herod did, she was the love of his life, but she barely loved him. From the point of her death, she dies very young, just, within 8 years of their marriage. Herod, he was a man who was so very distrustful, full of suspicions all the time. He always felt that people were, around him, plotting and intriguing against him. And every time, the historians write that every time he was forced to go out of Judea, he would leave written, instructions that in case if anything happens to him and he fails to return, she should be executed quickly without delay. These were the instructions the king would leave behind. Okay. Finally, she ends up dying in the year 29 BC in a fit of, rage and madness. He orders her this, and then the next day, when I don't know whether he was intoxicated or what, but the next day when he realizes that, the execution has already been carried out, he literally goes mad. And psychologists, psychoanalysts who study his uh, life, and in particular all the deeds of Herod, they point out that it is from this point on, Herod actually, degenerates into a very wild character. He goes into deep decline and becomes insane more and more, and his greatest acts of cruelty are actually carried out later after her death. It is also after her death that Herod plunges himself into his building program. So maybe that, the loss of Mariamne always left a big void in his life which was never filled. Later on, he did take many wives. Altogether, I think Herod had 10 wives, but nobody, I think, he loved with the passion with which he loved Mariamne. Jewish tradition also has this very interesting story that he was so stricken with remorse at her death on his own orders that he preserved her body in a vat filled with honey and often visited her at night. Historians point out that it was from the point of time that Herod went from this point on, he went on a downward spiral, ending almost demented towards the end of his reign in the 70s. He died a very old man. Okay? He had a very long tenure, almost 40 years of rule. We continue. Once in office, as the 30s BC wore on, okay, he finally became he became the king in 37. The 30s, from the 30s, things in Rome started changing. Okay, when Herod was crowned king by the Senate, there was one particular man there in the Senate called Mark Antony, who was his greatest admirer and his great patron. And Mark Antony was one of the co-rulers. Among three rulers, they were before an emperor was crowned, that is Caesar Augustus came to power. Prior to that, there were three men who were jointly ruling Rome, and that is why it is called a triumvirate. Mark Antony was one of them, and Mark Antony was his patron, his godfather, and that's how Herod came to become king. There was an intense past struggle in the 30s there in Rome between his ally Mark Antony, who, along with his consort Queen Cleopatra, you must have heard about Queen Cleopatra of Egypt, the very famous queen, okay, who finally ended up, killing herself with the famous, asp, the snake, when she lost the battle along with Mark Antony. Okay, they would end their lives in defeat at the Battle of Actium. Okay, and Octavian, who would now rule Rome as Augustus Caesar. So you can imagine when this famous Battle of Actium, it got over in 29 BC. In 29 BC, Mark Antony died, Cleopatra was no longer there on the scene, okay? And Octavian became ruler. You can imagine what must be the plight of Herod, because all this while, who was his greatest ally? Mark Antony. So Mark Antony was a great enemy, because when the civil war broke out between Octavian and Mark Antony, so Herod obviously was on the side of his patron Mark Antony, but he was on the losing side, and Octavian ended up becoming Caesar. But Herod's reign was marked by tyranny and ruthlessness in silencing rivals and dissenting critics of his Roman overlords. And the funds for his extraordinary buildings came from the heavy taxation of the people. So this was the feeling of the people against Herod. We no doubt later on, after Mariamne's death, he went on a massive building project. But from where did the funds come for all that? It always came from the heavy taxes, which ultimately the people had to pay. And apart from that, though Herod was, a powerful king of Judea, there was constantly a sort of, a fear that was nagging at his mind and heart. He always feared the glory of the Hashmonean family, because the Hashmonean family, since they were, considered to be the descendants of the king of King David, they were considered and seen upon by the people of Judea as the legitimate rulers, and not this man who was looked upon as a usurper who grabbed the throne of the Hashmonean family. So he was mighty scared of any Hashmonean family member, because he felt, any time he would have been deposed and the family would be restored back to power. And it is because of this fear that most of the time he, resorted to murder year after year any member of the Hashmonean family. Mariamne's two brothers, also young, boys. One of them was crowned. He himself made him the Jewish high priest. So when he, was given the title of Jewish high priest, and when the people at the temple, they hailed him. There was a multitude of people who, turned out, to hail him. Herod was so much, he literally burned with jealousy and also fear, because he feared that if these people can, win the hearts of the people and command, their respect and loyalty, it would be very easy for him, for the people to depose him. And what did he do? It seems he arranged for a big party, at Jericho. He had many palaces everywhere. At one of these palaces, there was a lot of food and all was arranged, games and all, to celebrate the occasion that he was, appointed the high priest to the people, because that was an occasion of great celebration to the people in Judea. But as the celebrations were going on, there was Herod's palaces always had, swimming pools full of water. He ordered his men to ensure that, when the young, I think it is Aristobulus, I think, the young two brothers of Mariamne, the elder one, he was barely 18 years when he was made the high priest. The moment he went there, to swim in the swimming pool, Herod's men held him down in such a way that he drowned. But it was actually a murder that was ordered by Herod. And, people knew that he was a chief conspirator, because one after another, Hyrcanus, Mariamne's grandfather also, with whom, Herod was on very good terms, he arranged his murder as well. Mariamne's both brothers also were murdered. And finally, not only that, he is also infamous for ordering the murder of Mariamne's and his two sons. Mariamne and he had two sons, both of them he ordered their murder as well. That is why Herod has come down in history as a child murderer. Okay, I put out his pictures here. Mark Antony was young Herod's great patron and friend, instrumental in convincing the Senate to make him the Judean king. Mark Antony was one of the co-rulers of Rome along with Octavian and Marcus Lepidus before a civil war broke out in Rome, in which finally, Octavian was emerged victorious, and he was the one who became the first emperor, Augustus. Mark Antony fled and he stayed with Cleopatra there, and the civil war broke out. From there, the Battle of Actium was launched, in which both ended up being defeated, and to avoid falling in the hands of Octavian, because he would obviously put them to a very shameful death. Both of them are supposed to have committed suicide. So this is this is Mark Antony in his military uniform. This is here as a senator, and this is the famous Queen Cleopatra with the Egyptian frown. After the defeat of Mark Antony at the Battle of Actium in 29 BC, Herod must have been a very nervous man, because he found himself on the wrong side of the power equation, because he always supported Mark Antony, and Mark Antony is dead now. It is very sad that though Mark Antony was the one who ended up making Herod what he was, the king, when Mark Antony actually required the support of Herod, Herod very slyly and very cleverly withheld his troops, because he knew that Mark Antony was losing the war. So probably he didn't want to invite the wrath of the future emperor, and that is why he tried to play safe. So this is very typical of Herod being a very treacherous man. So ultimately, this is the way he betrayed also his best friend. And look at what he does. The moment Octavian is crowned Emperor Augustus, Herod goes and puts himself actually bows in front of him and tells him that I'm submitting myself. You can do with me whatever you want. And at this point of time, it was such a dangerous moment, because if Octavian was a man who was very petty and could hold all of sour sentiments and hold feelings of revenge against Herod for having supported his bitter enemy, he could have easily ordered that Herod be stripped of all his powers, and not only that, he could have also ended up putting him to death. But surprisingly, Augustus accepted Herod's loyalty despite having been his arch enemy, Mark Antony's great supporter, and swiftly reinstated him as his client king of Judea. So the two of them developed a great partnership that lasted till Herod's death and beyond. And this is, this when their partnership went on to create history, because if Herod was able to accomplish all his achievements as a master builder of the ancient world, it was thanks, due to the support that he enjoyed and the very great intimate relationship that he enjoyed with Augustus and his household. So here I put out both these pictures here. This I've already put to point one. Herod's impressive public building projects transformed the landscape of Judea. He beautified Judea. We know that his temple renovation project ended up making the place one of the most beautiful temples in the ancient world. And not only the Jerusalem temple, he went about building huge fortress palaces, of which Masada was one of the most famous one. So for Herod, in fact, we focus a lot of attention on the Temple of Jerusalem. But today, scientists in particular, when they look at the harbor, the port city of Caesarea Maritima, it was a port city which was exclusively built by Herod. In fact, it was not a natural harbor at all. But he was such a marvelous, excellent builder. He had a sort of an innate, gift in him, by which he could design massive projects and actually implement them. What he did is, where there was no harbor and no possibility of building a harbor, he put in sort of a cement motor into the waters and created an artificial harbor. He built it up, and the archaeologists have proof of all that. So Caesarea Maritima, it became a world class, center not only of international trade, but it became a very, polished Greco-Roman city wherein there was a big, huge colony of all Roman people staying over there. So for him, Jerusalem temple was a gift for the heavenly king, that is God himself, and the city of Caesarea Maritima, another ancient wonder of the world, was a gift for the Roman Emperor Augustus Caesar. That is the reason it was a place, okay, very close to Samaria, part of that. He named it Caesarea Maritima. Maritima is it was a maritime port. So in honor of the emperor, he named the city Caesarea. In particular, a band of people, now we are coming back to the Zealots, the rebels, later called the Zealots, under the leadership of Hezekiah the Bandit, opposed Herod's rule very violently, carrying out daring attacks guerrilla style on his troops and prime properties throughout his reign. To many Jews, crowning a king who was not a descendant of King David, this was the vision by which they were fired. Why they wouldn't accept Herod as a king, and why did they mount this rebellion against him and carried out all these ambushes against him? It is because he was not a descendant of King David. He did not come from the line of the Hashmonean kings. And so they led the people of Judea in an all-out revolt, but Herod had Rome behind him. So obviously Herod was a very mighty man. Herod too violently. It's not that Herod only sat down and tried to only repulse their attacks. He went after them. He pursued them, persecuted them, ferreted them out of their hideouts in the dry city like Judean hills, because they used to hide in all these caves and all that, because they were being hunted by not only the Roman soldiers, by Herod's men also. So they used to be hiding, in these high cliffs and all, like this Dead Sea community where they hid all their Dead Sea scrolls. In those type of caves, they would be, holding out. So Herod blamed them for banditry. What would they do? Of course, they needed something to survive upon. So wherever there were caravans, there were trade caravans that were going along, because those were trade routes also going, caravans going to Egypt. They would ambush them, loot them, plunder the rich and the wealthy Judahite. So this was a war that, they were like Robin Hood style people. So the common people, the poor people, they considered them actually heroes. Though the Romans called them bandits, they never would call them that. They felt that what they were doing was legitimate. They are fighting a sort of a just and a holy war. This was their understanding. And they would plunder only the rich and the wealthy Jews. Herod's reign was marked by tyranny and ruthlessness in silencing not only rivals, but also dissenting critics of his Roman overlords. He came down heavily on the rebels, and whole masses of such rebels and their sympathizers were slaughtered. Some even took refuge in the temple to no avail. There was no mercy for young or old. No women, no children were spared, because they would go and hide out along with their families. Like madmen, his people, they took vengeance on people of all ages who were part of the rebel group. This is we learn all these things, from Josephus. He tells us the last of these rebels fled to caves dug into cliffs, convinced that Herod would not be able to reach them there. But Herod, being ruthless, he would lower his look at the way. Okay, this is very disturbing when you read, and you can just imagine how bad it must have been. He would lower, they went to this cliffs thinking that, there are such treacherous mountains, which army will want to, climb there, but no. Herod was, a very adamant man. He would push his armies, okay, to pursue these rebels also in these high cliffs and mountains. He would lower his soldiers using ropes near the mouth of their caves, using some kind of scaffolding. When the soldiers got there, they would throw some sort of smoke bombs into the cave, forcing the inmates come near the mouth, which included women and children. You are understanding what he was doing? They would he would lower his soldiers, they would put smoke bombs into that. So automatically, out of fear, what would be the response of the people who were in these hideouts, they would come to the opening of it. And that was the time, okay, that was the time. And when they did that, when they came to the mouth of the cave, the soldiers would yank them with hooks and throw them down the cliffs to their deaths. This is how Josephus, actually reports this. This was the way Herod was so ruthless and merciless, especially against the fourth philosophy people, the zealots and the rebels. And that is the reason this enmity between them, okay, it would never stop. These are the places how these are all, can you see? These are all the caves that they would hold out, and he would ferret them out like, how you try to, smoke out rabbits from a hole. And for this reason, okay, this always went on. From the beginning of his reign till his death, he always faced this problem. The rebels were fighting him and he was fighting the rebels. He continued to fight, okay, and Herod also continued to kill them. And this went on and on, okay. Once he tightened his grip on the throne of Judea, sensing that the temple played a pivotal role in Jewish lives, he decided to make it the most impressive building in the ancient world. And deep down in his heart, he always longed, okay, to win the approval of the Judean people, which ultimately never happened. Even the rabbis, in all the literature that they produced after the fall of the temple, there's only one line, he's spoken very badly, all because of his misdeeds. And there's just one, sort of very grudging appreciation of him, where they say that if one has not seen the temple which Herod built, one has not seen a beautiful building. This is the only thing he indirectly in praise the rabbis mention of him. The temple shimmered and dazzled with its inlaid gold sheets laid over white marble. Gentiles came there bearing gifts because for them it represented a place of power, of God's seat on earth. And that is the reason, okay, not only the Jews from Judea proper and also from the diaspora, but even the Gentile community, there used to be one particular group of people. Josephus calls them the Theosophists, means God-fearers. They were Gentiles, but who lived, according to the tenets of God's law. So these people, especially the ones who had great admiration and respect for the Jerusalem temple, and they would come bearing gifts. We have seen that's how the temple became a very rich place for the Saracen priesthood to exploit. For the Jewish people, the temple was God's throne, his footstool on earth, the place of his presence. But no beautification plan, no matter how magnificent it was, would make the Jewish rebels accept Herod as king of the Jews. They continued to fight him, and he also continued to kill them. These are not only I have not put out the Temple of Jerusalem because in several sessions I have already put that out. So these were the two main, besides this is the fortress of Masada which I mentioned. He had an entire palace, amazing, on such a huge mountain. Okay, and this will be the final stronghold of the Zealots even after the fall of the temple. Till 74 AD, 4 years, they remained holed up here, and still the Romans would not give them up. They built a ramp, went over there and seized Masada, which I will share. It's a very tragic story. So these are the cities. This is the port harbor. We first developed the port, which made finally Judea very, very rich, because all the grain and all going to Egypt started going from here because of what he had done. So he achieved this feat, which was supposed, which was considered to be unachievable, but he beat all the odds and made this a masterclass city. This picture is also part of the harbor city of Caesarea Maritima. So these are the zealots. Okay, this is the way. These were people. No matter what Herod did, okay, even after building such a massive, beautiful temple, they could never be won by him. They always considered him an intruder, a foreigner, a usurper. Okay, somebody who had occupied the throne by dethroning the rightful rulers. The aftermath of King Herod's death. After ruling Judea with an iron hand for almost 40 years, Herod died in 4 BC. After suffering terribly in the last years of his life, he was more than 70 years old when he died in great misery in his palace in Jericho. It's very interesting. He knew that he was hated so much by the Judean people that when he died, nobody would really mourn. Okay, he's passing away. So what did he do? What did he do? He ordered from his deathbed that all the nobles and all in Jerusalem they be captured and they were all kept in prison there in the one of his palaces, and he had given orders that the moment he died they are all to be executed to ensure that there would be mourning in the land. These are the we can't call them exploits, but these are the deeds of this mad king. And today, those who study the life of Herod, especially the psychologist and all, and even the scientists, the symptoms that he showed in the last years, it shows that he suffered from some very terrible affliction, which literally drew him mad. His genitals were sort of corrupted. They say it is one particular type of disease that infected his scrotum, and that is the reason with an unbearable pain he must have literally lost his sanity and went on mad. And that is the reason his eldest son Antipater also, just 3 or 5 days before his death, he ordered his death also because he was suspicious. He was fueled with the rumors that his son was fueling a rebellion in order to take the throne. So even till the end, when he knew he was dying, he was still clinging on to his power. And unfortunately, when you look into the life of Herod, you realize that this man, for him, what brought him down was his intense engagement with power, which he would not let go at any cost. And because of that, the people whom he loved the most, who were around him, his own sister, his brother, his brother's wife, and all, okay, his sister was a chief conspirator. She fueled his mind so much with all rumors that she fed his fears and suspicion, and that is why Herod was always very suspicious. He was very, very scared that people were plotting his death. The aftermath of Herod's death in 4 BC. When Herod died in 4 BC, Jerusalem erupted in joyful celebration. The rebels found it to be an opportune time. Okay, I just shared with you that detail that he had, imprisoned all the aristocrats and all in one of his fortress palaces. It is with the intervention of his sister that they were finally released and they let them go. But the rebels, they literally, they broke out in joyful celebration the whole over Judea. They celebrated, his death, and they also felt that his passing away and his death, since he ruled with an iron fist, since he is removed from the scene now, this would be the best time to overthrow the Herods and establish their own rule. For they believed that only God would be their king and no other. So seeing Herod dead, they attempted to seize power and mounted an insurrection under the leadership of Judas the Galilean, Hezekiah's son. Okay, this is in 4 BC, but Rome would have nothing of it. They quickly sent down their people and crushed this rebellion. Judas was hanged, okay, he was crucified, and so all the rebels, the last of them, they fled into the mountains. The Roman Emperor Augustus, a great friend of Herod the Great, appointed Herod's eldest son Archelaus as ruler of Judea. When he divided the kingdom of Herod the Great, he had left his own will how his kingdom is to be divided. But Rome was not pleased with any of his sons. Okay, we know how Herod Antipas became the ruler of Galilee. 1/4 of the territory of Herod the Great was given to him. That's how he became a tetrarch, ruler of only 1/4 of the land. But Judea proper, that is where Jerusalem was a seat, Archelaus, one of his eldest sons was given. But this man was so cruel, he ruled actually for 10 years. So from 4 BC till 6 AD, that is 4 years in the BC era and 6 years in the AD era comes to 10 years. His rule was extremely brutal, even more cruel than Herod himself. So because of that, finally, all the leaders in Jerusalem, they got together and they appealed Rome, to get him dethroned. There was a diplomatic mission that went there to Rome to appeal to the emperor. And when he was convinced, okay, he removed him, and he did not give Judea to any of the remaining sons of Herod, but they kept it directly under them. And this is how Judea became a province of Rome's direct rule under procurator from then on. We have one of the procurators, okay, Pontius Pilate, we know, and later on many will come. But this is a key fact, this is the turning point in the history. This is the reason why Roman presence became, a very constant feature around the temple. And finally, the reason also due to which the entire conflagration in the Jerusalem temple took place. So after 10 years of misrule, he was deposed, and Judea became completely a direct province of Rome. As a result of this strike, the region remained locked under vicious Roman repression for decades. Judea was in turmoil and teetering towards anarchy. So these were the Josephus calls them the followers of the fourth philosophy, the rebels, as they subscribed to none of the views held by the three other groups, that is, the Essenes, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees. I have already explained this to you. They wouldn't accept any foreign ruler because they were fired with the ideology that God alone is their king, and they cannot accept anybody else as their king. But the sad part of this Jewish history is that these rebels, okay, who swore that Rome was their enemy, they fought also some of their own people. Most of the time they ended up fighting not so much with the Romans but with their own fellow Jews. And we will see that in the final climactic events before the temple could fall, it was these people, the fighting amongst them, people were completely divided, and that's how Judea fell. For nothing enraged the rebels more than a Jew who abandoned Jewish traditions. To the rebels, the worst culprits were the wealthy Jews who broke the law God gave to Moses on Mount Sinai by conscripting slaves from amongst Jews. These wealthy Jews in Jerusalem, they used to have their own slaves because slavery was an accepted practice in ancient society, including in Rome. Rome, we have, slavery was very, very rampant, and the slaves were the ones who would come to very important position because Rome built up that sort of culture. But among the Jews, this was supposed to be a practice that was forbidden in the Hebrew scriptures. So these rebels pointed out that they were actually breaking the law that God had given to Moses on Mount Sinai. So they began attacking the huge estates of wealthy Jewish landowners and freeing their slaves, adding on to their numbers. They would call no one master. In their own eyes, they were the freedom fighters, but to the Romans, they were brigands and bandits. Here are some of the pictures I've put up. They would go and attack the wealthy states of the wealthy Jerusalemites. They would free all the slaves over there and add on to their ranks. So that's how their numbers would swell. This I think I will take in the next this. We will end over here. The emergence of the Sicarii. This is one group, of the Zealots which emerged after 52 AD and became a very important group which finally brought about a lot of infighting. Any questions? Do you have any questions? Because as Sicarii, I think there are another 3 or 4 slides I will have to explain in detail and continue with the session coming Sunday.